Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Eric Ferrero, Executive Director of the Fund for Investigative Journalism, and I'm really delighted to share the next hour with you. This webinar on source development will be led by two longtime journalists who are leaders at the Fund for Investigative Journalism and really leaders in our field. Bill Marimo, who is the president of the board of the Fund for Investigative Journalism, served previously as editor-in-chief of the Philadelphia Inquirer, also as editor of the Baltimore Sun, and as vice president for news at NPR. Among many other things, he's a two-time Pulitzer Prize recipient, and we're delighted that he's here to share his sort of lessons, thoughts, and insights on developing source relationships. We're also delighted that Cheryl W Thompson is leading this session with us. Cheryl serves as vice president of the Fund for Investigative Journalism's board of directors. She's also the immediate past president of Investigative Reporters and Editors. She is an investigative correspondent at NPR and also senior editor of Station Investigations at NPR, and previously served for nearly 20 years as an investigative reporter at the Washington Post, where among many other things, she was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize. Bill and Cheryl are going to engage in conversation and share some thoughts and lessons and insights with all of you about source cultivation and source relationships. We'd ask you as they're talking to be jotting down questions that you have for both of them. At about 12:10 or by 12:10, we'll break their conversation and really turn for the last solid 20 minutes to questions that you have for them. So be sure to be jotting down your questions and thinking of them. You can share them in the chat as you think of them or jot them down on your own and we'll get to you. We're delighted to see so many people here and to see some familiar current and former grantees and leaders in the field joining us for the webinar today. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Bill and Cheryl with great thanks to both of you for leading this session with us.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you guys for spending the next hour with us, taking an hour out of your day to spend with us. And we hope this will be a fun conversation and a learning conversation as well. So I want to start by asking Bill a question, because Bill is one of those journalists that I always regret I didn't get a chance to work with, or that, you know, he had hired me somewhere along the way. So I always regret that. So now I've got him here. So I'm going to ask him some tough questions about. So the first thing I want to talk about, Bill, I want to ask you, like, what advice do you have for reporters who are either new to a beat or just new reporters starting out in terms of developing sources?
Well, Cheryl, that's a good question. And I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to work together. So now I'm a captive audience. At any rate, here are 4 or 5 ideas or principles that I would consider. First of all, when you arrive in a new city and on a new beat, let's say the police beat, before you even start, I would read every clip, every single story that was written, posted, or aired about the subject you're covering. So if it's the police department and you're coming to a local station for public radio, listen to everything you can, read everything that's been written, absorb it, take notes, think about what follow-up stories you can do now that you're on the beat. Secondly, and this is really critical, when you interview someone, hopefully in person, live up to the letter and the spirit of every commitment you make. When you say something is off the record, it is off the record. Not for attribution, you can use it, but you can't use the person's name. It's critically important that you keep your word, because trust and respect are the glue that really bind a journalist and a source. Third piece of advice is this, and it's practical, and I think it's effective. And that is, when you get to an interview stage with someone who's a source, let's say it's the police chief of Dayton, Ohio. Be looking for a good, solid, valid story where your interest in that story and the police chief's interest converge. So let's take a hypothetical. Suppose the chief in Dayton says to you, Cheryl, I've been trying to persuade the city council and the mayor to approve this new gadget that helps us solve arson cases, but they won't authorize the money. And the police chief tells you about it. You say to yourself, that's really interesting. I haven't heard about that tool. You then write a story that incorporates how much it costs, find some cities where it's been used effectively, some cities where it's been disappointing. Try to find out who invented the tool and talk to that person, and do a story that is so broad and so deep that the police chief will say to himself, holy hell, how did that reporter find the inventor of this machine? This is really an effective story. And by doing a story like that, that really impresses and wows your source, you'll have established a foundation for good relations and good stories. Two more tools that I would suggest. Number one, talk to the senior reporters who at the news organization where you're going to, and ask them for their advice. As we both know, when you talk to your newsroom colleagues and you're a novice or someone who's just arrived, usually they're very, very welcoming and anxious to talk. And then last but not least, talk to the person you're interviewing and ask him or her, what person or what persons do you consider your most effective mentors? Who are they? What did you learn from them? And where are they now? And as soon as you finish that interview, get in touch with the mentors. Usually when someone is removed from the fray, when they're no longer in the epicenter of the news, they have time to talk with you. And a former official likes nothing more than to pontificate, share their perspective, and share their insights. So if, for example, someone was doing a story on the Philadelphia Inquirer, an in-depth story, and they came to me, they would have someone who would have the time, the perspective, and the experience to help them out on the story. So those are my ideas for when you arrive in town.
Well, there are a couple of good points that I just sort of stopped in my tracks. One is to read everything when you come, right? You're the new person on the beat, you're the new person in the job, you don't know anything or you know very little. And another reason I think for reading the clips is to get to know the players, right? To get to know who's in what position, sort of where they stand sometimes on certain issues. So I think reading clips and reading stories, because there's nothing worse than going into an interview and you're trying to develop sources and you haven't done your homework, right? So I think reading clips and figuring out who's who will really pay off in the long run. And the other point was when you mentioned to impress and wow your sources. I remember when I was fairly new at the Washington Post, because I was there from 97 until 2019. And I remember there was a judge who later became, I'm not sure if he was a chief judge at the time, he may have been, but he's dead now, so I can talk about him. I learned that and I was just learning the beat, and I didn't have the courthouse beat, but courts and police kind of go hand in hand. So I was over there and I was talking, and I learned that he and his wife had fostered dozens of children over the years. And I thought that would be a really good story, right? So I did a little feature story, right? At the time we had this weekly section, the Post had a weekly section as well. And I did this story and he loved it. And from that point on, anytime I needed anything, I would call him up and he would help me. So, we had a really good relationship until he retired. So, and I also found out during the course of our time that he and I went to the same university. We both graduated from the same university. So, but I can talk about commonalities and developing sources a little later.
Cheryl, one story you told me was about your relationship with the former Washington Police Commissioner, Charles Ramsey, who later became the police commissioner in Philadelphia, where I got to know him and respect him. And I'd be interested in you sharing with our group what happens when someone you've covered leaves that job, moves somewhere else, but you can still maintain a source relationship and perhaps even get better candor. Could you talk about that?
So I think Police Chief Ramsey and I started out sort of on a good foot, right? I mean, he's the police chief. He's never going to tell you anything bad about his department. So, you want to kind of stay away from developing the top people as your sources because they're not going to give you anything negative about their agency. But what we had was, so when he got the job, the Metro editor at the time said, I want you to go to Chicago, get on a plane, go to Chicago and get an interview with him and come back. And I'm like, okay, I didn't know anybody. And so I actually made nice with one of Ramsey's sergeants and I found out what flight Ramsey was on. And I got a ticket to come back with him, but I couldn't get a seat next to him. I found out where his sergeant had told me where he was going to be sitting, but I couldn't get a seat next to him. So when I got on the plane, I saw him and I did a little finagling. There was a woman who was sitting next to him. And I explained to her who I was. I said, I'm a reporter. This guy just got the job as chief, and I really need to talk to him on this flight back to Washington. Do you mind changing seats with me? And she's like, oh, honey, no, I'm in PR. I totally understand. So she gave me her seat. And Dan Ball, who's a longtime political reporter at the Post, happened to be on the plane as well. And when we got off, he applauded like, you really got a lot of nerve. But when we got off the plane, there was a local reporter, Tom Sherwood, for those of you who know Tom Sherwood in DC, and he was waiting there with his cameraman to capture Ramsey. And he sees me coming off with Ramsey, he goes, damn it, Cheryl. How did you do this? And we still laugh about that. But so the chief and I had from that point forward, we had a good working relationship. What also helped me, I think, was I had an uncle years ago when I was a kid growing up I'm from Chicago, like Ramsey's from Chicago. We're both Catholic. We had these commonalities. And so that sort of went over well with him. But I still knew not to get too close to him. He was a police chief. And we just had this good working relationship. And my uncle had been a police commander. And I mentioned it to Ramsey. I said, oh, my uncle was a commander. And he says, what's his name? And I told him, he says, oh, he was my captain when I was a rookie. And so from that point on, it worked. And so, listen, this isn't to say that he liked every story I did. As a matter of fact, it was just the opposite. Because he told me once, he said, Cheryl, I really don't like these stories that you're writing about my department because they weren't flattering. I'm not a feature writer. That's not what I do by trade. And so he said, but he gave me, I think, one of the best compliments I've ever had as a journalist. And that is, I don't necessarily like your stories, but you're fair. And to me, I don't really care whether you like the story, but I do care that whether people think I'm fair and balanced. And so that's why he always talked to me. And then when he left and went to Philadelphia, I was doing a gun series with some colleagues at the Post. And my job was to find out the police officers who had been killed by guns. And so I found a case in Philadelphia that I really was interested in. And, when you're a reporter too, and you have sources and, I may not have them in every city, but you go where you have sources to try and, get what you can. And so I remember calling the chief up and saying, I'm doing this story on guns and I really need somebody, can you help me? And he went out of his way to help me. And because, again, I was no threat, right? Because he's done in Washington, he's moved on. So that goes back to what Bill was saying, is former people can really be helpful. And he was really helpful to me in that instance. And so we still keep in touch.
Good story, Cheryl. So another thing we wanted to talk about was developing, retaining, and also protecting confidential sources. And I brought with me what I'll call an exhibit. Most of you can't see.
We like letters.
Yes,
we like things in writing.
So this is a story about how I developed 15 sources in the FBI. And the fact that when you make a promise of anonymity to a source, it's very serious. because it can put their jobs or even their lives in jeopardy. So I'll try to compress this to get to the letter, and then I'll read the letter to you. But I was covering a political corruption case called Abscan, which some of you more veteran reporters may remember. It was a case in which the FBI created a phony Arab sheik who went up and down the East Coast giving payoffs to both local and federal political office holders. And in the course of that, I met one of the sheik's phony representatives, an FBI agent named Mike Wald, who's now deceased. And we got to know each other during the Abscan trial. And he asked me afterward, would I consider doing a story on the FBI's labor squad, which had had some notable prosecution successes, but also some disappointments. And I told Mike the answer was yes. I would do it on two conditions. Number one, that I can interview all 15 agents on the labor squad one-on-one for at least a half hour or an hour. And number two, that he would understand this was not going to be a puff piece. This would be a story that looked at their attributes and also their drawbacks. And I would be talking to defense lawyers and anyone else who dealt with them. I did a story. I actually may have it here. I could read you the lead. This is the lead. And this is the headline, actually. It says, win or lose, FBI Squad 4 keeps regions unions on its toes. And here's the lead. One Monday in June, FBI Special Agent John Tam telephoned the headquarters of Teamsters Local 326, and without identifying himself or his employer, asked for the union president, Francis J. Sheeran. It was the day on which Sheeran's longtime business associate, Eugene Baffa, had been convicted after a dogged and lengthy Labor Department investigation. Tam recalled saying that he had confidential information that he would relate only to Sheeran. And after a few minutes wait, the burly Teamsters union president came to the phone. Quote, Sheeran, the FBI agent said, this is John Tam in the FBI, and I want you to know that you're next. And then he used a word that I can't repeat here, but it begins with M and has F in the middle and ends with ER. And that was the story on the FBI labor squad. You can figure out what it is, Cheryl. At any rate, because of that story, I now had 15 agents in the FBI who would talk with me, never on the record, but often not for attribution and frequently on background. And later I did a story about an FBI agent, first time ever in the Philadelphia office, who had been convicted of corruption on the job. And I did the story based on sources who felt the FBI might cover it up if the inquiry didn't cover it. And the SAC then went on a witch hunt to try to figure out.
That's the special agent in charge, right? And
Yes.
SAC is the SAC. Mhm.
Yes, the special agent in charge in Philadelphia went on a witch hunt trying to figure out which agent or agents had given me the information. The special agent in charge alighted, targeted the wrong person. And as a result, this agent was demoted from the labor squad to basically reviewing records in the archive, and then was transferred out of Philadelphia altogether. He wrote, when I called him to ask if I could help in some way, he wrote me this letter, which I have here, and it says the following. Thanks for the book. I'd loaned him a book. You already have my assessment. Unfortunately, due to your printing the story on Frank Olivas on January 15th, I am forced to sever any contact of any type from here to the end of my employment with the FBI. Looking back at what has transpired, the negatives of that article at that time far outweighed the positive and the public's right to know at that time. Sorry, but sometimes situations are stronger than the need for people to associate. And for me, this situation has progressed to such a level of strength. Let me finish, Cheryl. I then asked the executive editor of the Inquirer, his name was Gene Roberts, if I could offer to give a written statement saying that this man was not my source, a sworn statement, because I felt so strongly that he had been railroaded. And Gene Roberts said, yes, I could do that. So I called the man's attorney, who was a former US attorney named Clayton Underkoffler. And I said, Clayton, I would be happy to do this if it would help get him reinstated. He wasn't my source. And Clayton said, this is hopeless. No, thank you.
Wow. So that's an interesting letter. I can honestly say I've never received a letter like that. What lesson did you learn from that? What was the lesson? I mean, what was his point and what did you take away from that?
I think Cheryl and everyone out there, it reinforced my belief in the critical importance of living up to the letter and the spirit of every commitment you make to a source. When someone like this FBI agent gives, or any FBI agent gave me confidential information that was not yet ready to be in the public domain, they were putting their jobs at risk. And I always believed that you should treat a source this way. Let's say that you're a reporter who's 22 years old, you just graduated from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and you join the Northampton Daily Gazette, and you cover the police. You should treat that police chief as if you're going to be seeing him every morning for donuts and coffee at Starbucks for the next 45 years until you retire. That you have to look that person in the eye and make sure that you've lived up to the letter and promise of your commitment. Because people like the FBI agents are not political spinmeisters. These are people, usually they have an agenda, but they're also putting their jobs at risk when they share information with you.
So it's really important then, so not only do you get to know your sources, but your sources get to know you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Cheryl, how do you define the best ways to get to know someone and kind of reinforce that relationship over time?
So for me, I think it depends on what you're covering, right? I mean, it's so funny. People always consider me a police reporter. I never covered criminal justice till I came to the Washington Post. I covered education. I covered City Hall. I was not the criminal justice girl, but once I became one at the Post, I had to. The first thing I learned was that police officers are really not very trusting, and probably nor should they be, of people. And so I've learned that when if you're trying to develop sources with a police officer, if you ever break that trust, they will never, ever, ever speak to you again. So you really do have to be a person of your word. And so for me, when I came, this is gonna sound so sexist, and it really is. But when I came in the late 90s, I remember I was going over to police headquarters for the first time. And there was a researcher, and I won't call her name because she may be on this call. And she said, where are you going? I said, well, I'm going over to police headquarters. And she said, come here. So I walked over to her, I had on a skirt, and she looked at me and she said, it's short enough. So I was like, oh my God, like cops are like, I was like, oh, I'm in for a rude awakening. But you also you have to, what I did to develop sources was I just kept showing up. Right, because for me, Bill, I was going to ask you about this a little later about in-person interactions, but it's better to meet people in person because they don't know who you are on the phone. They don't know, you send an email, they don't know who you are. So I go over there and I just start talking to people and tell them I'm new. And I also sort of, when I'm trying to develop sources, I don't act like I know everything because usually I don't, but I found that people are willing to help you if you act like you don't know everything. In other words, make them feel like they're smart. And so because I was dealing with mostly men, there were a few women, but mostly men in the police department at that time. I had to, feel them out. I feel out people because there's no one set answer for how you develop sources. I think you really have to talk to the person and see what their personality is and see sort of where they're coming from and how, it's really about instinct. And so some of my best police sources, I just worked over time, and I would do stories. And once they saw that their names weren't in the stories, as I promised they wouldn't be, then the trust developed, right? You have to, like Bill said earlier, you really have to keep your word. And so then I would ask them to lunch. And I know, during COVID, things have been really tough, but I would invite them to lunch. And it got to the point where my sources were so good and so helpful. I mean, they were crazy helpful, that one of them would come by and pick me up in an unmarked car for lunch. He would come by the post, and we would go down to Virginia because he didn't want to be seen with me. I guess that's a good thing, I don't know. But he was trying to protect himself as well. And these are people who I've developed over the years, who I still keep in touch with, because one of the things that I think is really important when you're trying to create sources and maintain those key relationships is to call them regularly or stop by regularly, even when you don't need or want anything, right? Because people know when they're being played. They do. And so reaching out just to say hello or to check in can go a long way in terms of developing and maintaining a relationship. I remember years later, after one of my sources had left the department and he had gone on to another department. And I remember I called him up and he's like, "What do you want?" And I'm like, "I don't want anything. I just want to say hello." Now, I knew that I was going to need something in a couple of weeks. Right? But I did want to say, hey, but I called, because the first thing I was, "What do you want?" I'm like, "I don't want anything."
Cheryl, that's called malice aforethought.
Sometimes I really didn't want anything. I like these people in terms of like how helpful they were to me. Right. And so sometimes I would just say, hey, I mean, I got to know through them, their families. Like, I can tell you stories about, I haven't met most of them, but spending time with your sources and asking about their lives away from the whatever agency it is you're covering can really help too, because it shows your sources that you really act like you care, about something other than just today's story. And I think that's how you maintain long-term relationships, is to really develop a relationship, but you also keep it at a certain distance, right? I never got too cozy with my sources. I never invited any of them to my home. I never went to their homes. We always kept it on a business level.
I have a couple other general tips that I think are particularly effective for people embarking on their careers or 2 or 3 years into it. One is what I call the audit. And this is that after you've written a story, posted a story, or aired a story, to the next day, either call or go to see some of the key people you've quoted and ask them, in all honesty, was the story accurate? Was it thorough? Was it fair? Now, when I was a young reporter, and this would be the 1970s, my my colleagues in the City Hall Bureau would say, "Bill, are you crazy? Why do you want all that flack?" The truth was that I was a relatively inexperienced reporter. I didn't have a lot of confidence, and I really wanted to get the appraisal from the people I covered, whether I'd missed something, whether it was, unbalanced. And the audit had 3 benefits, 2 short-term, 1 long-term. The first benefit was that I actually got some critical feedback. And when I made a mistake or missed a nuance, I learned something. And I was the kind of reporter who didn't make the same mistake twice, although I did make mistakes. The second benefit was particularly in the era of intense competition between news organizations, both radio, TV, and newspapers. Sometimes by talking to a source the next day, I discovered another story, something that was developing or would develop. It usually wasn't earth-shaking, but it created momentum on the beat, and it reinforced the relationship. But the most important benefit of all, and this is a benefit that spanned years or even decades, because no one else on that beat was doing what I was doing, my sources started to trust me. It created the implicit idea that this is a person who really cares about the solidity of his work. And as a result, when these people had something they wanted to tell someone, not something they didn't want to tell anyone, but when they had something they wanted to tell anyone, they called me or got in touch with me. And that's ironically the way the story developed on the FBI agent who was being fired for corruption. They felt that the special agent in charge was going to try to avoid publicizing it. So the audit is a really great benefit. And the other suggestion for everybody, and this is one that took me quite a while to formulate, is that when you're writing a story about a subject that you're not familiar with, or one in which you can't get people to talk with you at length, assemble your own, what I'll call panel of experts, a Cheryl Thompson panel of experts. And these would be people, 4 or 5 people who are so steeped in the knowledge of the subject you're covering that when the person you're covering reads their names, they will go, wow, how did he ever get them to talk to him? And I'll give you one example of this briefly. In 1980, ages ago, there was a new mayor in Philadelphia named Bill Green. And the biggest problem he had was a yawning $200 million deficit that he had to fill in his first 3 months in office. His finance director was a young man who had not dealt with the press. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get him or any of his deputies to talk with me. So I just assembled a panel of experts, and they were every living former city controller in Philadelphia and every living former finance director in Philadelphia. And I would ask them, if you were in Mayor Green's shoes, what would you do? And I did this week after week after week. And some of them were willing to be quoted, but the wisest old owl of all was a man named Lennox Moak, long deceased. And Mr. Moak said to me, Bill, I'll give you my perspective, but you can never quote me. You can never use my name. You can't even refer to me as a former city official. So what I would do is talk to Mr. Moak, and then I would give his ideas to the people on the panel of experts who would talk, and they would then ratify them and explain them. The beauty of this arrangement was that I could write analyses that ran on the front page of the Inquirer. It turned out to be very prescient. The reason they were prescient is because Lennox Moak's protege, a young man named Ed DeSev, was the finance director of the city who wouldn't talk with me. And every day that I called Lennox Moak for advice, Ed DeSev was calling him for advice and then passing on the advice to the mayor. So much so that the mayor, Bill Green, called me and said, who is leaking this information to you, Marimo? And the truth was no one. It was the panel of experts. So I'd urge all of you starting a new beat or covering a story that you're not familiar with, find 4 or 5 people who are wise and experienced and begin cultivating a relationship with them.
I think that's genius. And I also, your audit tip is really good. I do that when I was covering a beat. I still do it on my longer projects, but I always did it because I always would call people the next day, right? Because you know that if there's something wrong with the story, the officials are going to be the first one to call, right? But your sources may not, well, they may see something like, well, maybe she could have done this, but they're not going to call you. So reaching out to them, because there's nothing factually wrong with it, but you do want to gauge them because you always want people to think that you're fair. And so I think by doing that, that helps build trust too with your sources, right? It's like, because again, like Bill said, you care enough to pick up the phone and go, hey, what did you think of the story today, right? And you never know, you may get a follow-up by making those calls. Sometimes I would get a follow-up because they might go, oh yeah, you know, the story was good and blah, 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 but let me tell you what I just heard. Because of that story, now they're going to do X, Y, and Z. So, you know, I think there's a few reasons for doing those audits, but I think it's a really good habit to get into is following up with people the next day just to see what they think. Because
and Cheryl, I think I'd like to get your views on this too, but for everyone out there, there are occasions like the experience I had where the finance director wouldn't talk with me at all, where you have to use, I guess, the widest possible array of sources of information. And in my opinion, a story is not complete until you've, number one, done all the possible interviews you can. And if you can't interview the subjects, people who know the subject itself. Number two, using all public records. a lot of people are more comfortable interviewing and not using records. Others like to use records but don't like people. But you really need records, you need people, and you also need, where possible, firsthand observation. When you've done all three of those checks, then you have the framework for a complete story, a story that's not black, not white, but nuanced. So for all of you out there, again, interviews, records, firsthand observations.
Well, and I would say too, if you don't like people, journalism probably isn't the career for you. Just saying.
Cheryl, I'm sure you've had colleagues, I know I have, who really prefer no comment to a face-to-face interview. And
well, I gotta tell you, once I got a front page story by someone who didn't say anything to me, right? This was back, I was covering the Los Angeles Unified School District, and which was at the time, I think it still might be the second largest school district in the country. And they were having a lot of budget problems. And I had gone down to headquarters, to the school district office, and there was a budget hearing. And I knew the budget director, right? He was friendly enough to me. And I knew they were having a lot of budget problems, and the superintendent at the time had come out publicly and said, you know, we're going to, this is crazy, because teachers were buying toilet paper and buying everything out of their own pockets. And he said, you know what, we're going to share the pain. Those were his words. I will never forget, those were his words. We're going to share the pain in this. So never fear, we're with you, teachers, in this. And I remember going up to the budget director. I have no idea why I said this to him, but he was sitting there. And I said, hey, Bob, I said, did the superintendent take a pay cut? Because they were all going to take pay cuts. And he looked at me and he went, and I said, did you? I said, did anybody in the administration? He didn't utter a word because he didn't want his name attached, right? But then I just went and started interviewing, and the next day, front page story, he failed to share the pain. And of course, it was a strong teachers union, and they like went ballistic. And 2 days later, I got a call that he was resigning, and he was the first Hispanic superintendent, and he was really a lovely guy, right? But he did something that, you know, he wasn't honest with people about what he was going to do. And so that was one of the stories where the guy didn't talk to me, but I got like one of the biggest scoops ever. And I beat the LA Times, which was, you know, I always loved beating the LA Times.
So Bill and Cheryl, it's 12:10. And as promised, we wanted to reserve the last 20 minutes for questions from folks in the webinar. We have about 10 questions in the chat and another 5 that have come in through the Q&A. Cheryl, do you prefer to fish those out, or do you want me to toss those to you guys?
Let's see if I can fish them out without disconnecting y'all. Yes, so, okay, so this is from Anonymous. I love anonymous people. Not really. What are the first things you would do to start developing sources when you're covering a beat or topic for a national outlet? It seems a bit overwhelming at first. Bill, you wanna?
Sure. I think, Cheryl, that before I began the beat, let's say you're covering the Pentagon. I would, as I said at the beginning, I would read every story written about the Department of Defense. I would listen to broadcasts. I would watch TV. And if it were me, I would be, as I went through the stories, I'd be writing down possible follow-ups, possible profiles, possible features, stories that would be not hard-hitting at first, but classic explanatory journalism. If I were going to the Pentagon, I would try to find 2 or 3 people that I know, or that someone I know well knows well. And for instance, if I were going to the Pentagon tomorrow, I would get in touch with Jennifer Griffin, who works for Fox News and is a terrific reporter. She happens to be my goddaughter. And I would say, Jennifer, I need some guidance. How did you start? I'd go to Jeffrey Shogel, who also covers the Pentagon, and ask him, you know, give me some ideas on how to begin this beat. And with the ideas in hand, with talking to some veteran reporters. I then go to see the head of public information, whose job it is to deal with the media. And I would say, I have 3 or 4 ideas, and I wonder if you could help me get in the door to meet General so-and-so or Deputy Secretary of Defense so-and-so. And I'd be looking for those stories, which are excellent stories by anyone's standards, but stories that are going to explain rather than prosecute or peak.
Okay, and I'm of a different ilk. I would go to former reporters at my publication and say, hey, how did you, or people who formerly covered the beat at my publication, because I'm so paranoid. I'm competitive, I'm paranoid. I don't want anybody to beat me on anything. So that's what I would do. But again, and maybe if it's a bit overwhelming, like create a spreadsheet. I'm a big believer in like spreadsheets and Google Docs and stuff, and just to stay organized. And, maybe after you read all those clips, make a list of key people for that agency and, get their email, their phone number, and then just sort of like try to work the list. Because somebody's gonna, you're gonna develop a source somewhere along the way there. So that's what I would do.
The other bit of general advice I would have is to think about the long-term consequences of your short-term actions, so that a lot of people are anxious to make a big splash, to get right in there and have dynamite reporting. My thought about covering a beat is that you build a foundation, and that building a foundation doesn't take days or weeks. It takes months and years. And to develop an expertise on something like the Pentagon or the US Supreme Court, you need to be patient. And there is significant competition on these beats, but there's also some collegiality and mutual admiration. And I agree with you, Cheryl, it'd be best to go to the person who had the beat at your own organization rather than elsewhere. But I do believe that the competition is not quite cutthroat. Over time, it becomes one of mutual respect too.
This is Washington. Cutthroat and Washington. Okay. So the next question, and then maybe after this Q&A question, Eric, we can go back to the chat because I don't want to ignore people in the chat. This is from Lisa. She wanted to, I guess this is for me, when I sat next to Ramsey on the plane, did I make small talk or immediately ask him to go on the record, or a combo of both? And why do I think he played ball? This is the one thing I could say for certain about Charles Ramsey. He is very media savvy. Right, he is like his own PR machine. He didn't need a PIO in that police department. He spent 31 years in the Chicago Police Department, so he was definitely used to the press. But I always make small talk with people. I didn't come and sit right next to him and go, so like, why did you take this job? You have to sort of ease into it. But also, he had come there before, and so I met him there before. So he kind of knew who I was, but I still sat out, and he kind of laughed, because he watched that woman, he watched the interaction between the PR woman, who he didn't know, she just happened to be sitting next to him, and he watched that interaction. I think he sort of got a chuckle out of it and thought, okay, like, how bad could this woman be? Little did he know. But anyway, so I always try to make small talk with people for a minute, right? Because I knew I had a couple hours on the plane. He couldn't go anywhere. He was sort of like a captive audience, and that worked in my favor too. And so I think that's those things. And also, he was starting a new job. He wanted to make a good impression. He's the new incoming police chief after several dysfunctional years in that police department by his predecessor. So I think all of those things played a role in why he talked to me. And it was a good profile too, by the way. It ended up being, because he's chatty, and I've never known him to, I can't say this for everybody, but I've never known him to lie to me. And I always respected that if he couldn't tell me something, he'd tell me he couldn't tell me. And then I'd go somewhere else and get it. But at least he was, I felt that he was always pretty straight with me. Bill, you want to take a question in the chat, or?
Cheryl, since you're more technologically proficient,
oh God,
why don't you pick out a couple good ones?
All right, you're really trying my hands on the button here. Okay, let me move this over. Okay, I'm in the chat. So, okay, so how, Bill, and I know I'm not starting at the top here, does Bill's guidance about building a foundation with stories your sources might appreciate change, if at all, if you're strictly an investigative reporter? So Bill, did you?
And the answer to that is absolutely yes, it does. And I think that if you arrive in a strange city and you are a local investigative reporter, it's much more difficult and much trickier to start out working on big projects rather than a beat. But I think the best way to do that is to find out in terms of the subject you're investigating, who are people who are experts, who has a reputation within the newsroom you're joining for being a straight shooter, thoughtful, experienced, and someone who's approachable, and then proceed from there. But most of my investigative reporting as a reporter stemmed from having covered beats and witnessed firsthand subjects that required attention. When I went to Baltimore and NPR and helped worked with the investigative reporters there, I was able to give them guidance based on the techniques I've outlined, which really are to balance the expert witnesses with confidential sources, public records, firsthand observations, and to always look for nuance, to try to balance it's no story is 0 or 100. They're all gray in some way or another. And I think a lot of young reporters are looking to prosecute cases or defend cases rather than really analyze and investigate. So it's important to look for the nuance, to master both sides, what I'll call both poles of the possible truth. If you're doing a story on police violence, which is something, Cheryl, that you've done a lot of, and so have I, you want to talk with the police officers who allegedly were guilty of police violence. You want to talk to the person who is the alleged victim. Most importantly, you want to talk to independent eyewitnesses. And in this era, where you have the ubiquitous iPhones, it's much easier to document these incidents of alleged criminal violence. But again, starting in a new city as an investigative reporter is a challenge.
So another question, and I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this person's name right. Maybe it's Katie. Can you talk about guidelines and tips for dealing with potentially hostile sources who are subjects of things like corruption, environmental abuse investigations?
Could you repeat that one, Cheryl?
Yeah, can you offer tips and guidelines for dealing with potentially hostile sources who are subjects of things like corruption and abuses investigations?
Yeah. I think it's critically important to do everything humanly possible to see the target in person. And if you can't see the target in person, the person has an attorney, go see the attorney. And if you get in to see the person, I would always start out with questions that are neutral rather than pinpoint precise. Try to get the person to understand that you're here to understand their account. One of the things that I always did when I began these types of interviews was saying, I know you have an account of what happened. I would really like to hear it and to sit back and listen. I didn't use tape recorders unless someone was taping me, taping them. I often had in the back of my reporter's notebook a list of 3 or 4 questions that I had to ask before I left. And sometimes I would repeat the question again and again. And when someone wouldn't submit to an interview, I always sent them certified letters saying, I'm investigating the case of William Cradle, who was stopped by police at the corner of 5th and Spruce on such and such a night. And you arrested him. I'd like to talk with you. Here's my home number. Here's my office number. I'm willing to meet with you any day or night, weekday or weekend. Let me know. Usually those certified letters elicited a signature and no interview, but it demonstrated to the readers or the listeners that we had done everything humanly possible to master the other side of the story?
Yeah, for me, I think I spent 3 years once investigating a politician here in Maryland who was corrupt. And I kind of thought he might be, but I had to do the stories to figure it out. And, the first time I went and interviewed him, it was, he thought, oh, he didn't know me. And he thought, oh, this is going to be easy peasy. And he gave me an interview, and then there was a story that didn't, wasn't favorable, but at least he talked to me. And then the second time I went back, he was a little apprehensive. And then the third time when I showed up on somebody's doorstep, he totally shut me down. And because he knew these stories where they were going, right? And in the end, and so what I hate to do, but what sometimes you have to do as a journalist to make sure, and this is getting into interviewing and less of source development, is you have to make sure that you make every attempt to get every side of a story. And so I ultimately ended up putting the questions in writing to him, which I hate to do because, people then know you've basically laid out your story for them, and it could backfire, but you've also given people a fair chance. And of course, he still didn't talk to me, but that's okay, because I could put in the story that I sent him these, 28 questions and he refused to, answer them or whatever. And in the end, he ended up going to prison for 6 years. So I smile, I'm not smiling because of it, but it was I wonder, maybe you should have talked to me. Maybe I would have understood, he could have helped me understand all of this, but I know that's getting a little off track, but he's one of few hostile people I've dealt with. And so it's never easy dealing with hostile people, but you have to remember that at the end of the day, you have the final word. And so you really do have to bend over backwards to be fair. But at the end of the day, you can't force people. You can't force people to deal with you, but you do your best. I don't know if that answers their question or not. I'm going to move on to Frank's question of, should we express to an officer the intention to speak off the record when I send him an email? No. How do I express to him or her my intention to speak off the record if they want? Bill, take it away.
Okay, and the question is what, Cheryl?
So should reporters express it to an officer the intent to speak off the record when they email them? In other words, I send you an email, Bill, and I say, hey, can you talk to me off the record about blah, 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 blah?
I would say definitely not. To me, that's not the first resort, it's the last resort. And many times, in a big police department like Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia, most of the officers are prohibited by regulation from talking with the press unless the police chief authorizes it. So a lot of these interviews have to be not for attribution. One tip for everybody, particularly in big cities, is I found that the fraternal organizations of African-American officers are often great sources of perspective, information, and facts. When I was writing about the Philadelphia Canine Unit and a group of officers whose dogs were attacking innocent, unarmed people, I found that the leaders of an organization called the Guardian Civic League were willing to talk to me on the record about some of the conduct of the canine dogs, not the officers per se, but the dogs. And I learned from them, for instance, that in Philadelphia in the 80s, the dogs were trained to attack on a verbal command. Get 'em, macho. But they were not trained to release on verbal command, so that if a dog attacked a human being, the officer had to choke the dog in order to stop the attack. And I couldn't get anyone any active officers in the department to tell that to me on the record. So what I did was I had my sources talk to the president of the Guardian Civic League, and he in turn talked to me on the record. So I was able to write the story quoting Harold James, who was the president of the Guardian Civic League, saying that he had talked to active officers about the training techniques. So be on the lookout for the Fraternal Order Police, Guardian Civic League, Hispanic officers, and others. They're often good sources.
Yeah, my advice would be, when you email somebody, I agree with Bill. I definitely wouldn't say, hey, talk to me off the record. I wouldn't put that in writing. Just remember, and I know y'all know this, when you put something in writing, you have to think that everybody from the lowest level person to the mayor to Congress could see that email. All you gotta do is hit a button and send it, right? And then that officer not only will never talk to you again, but could lose their job. So be mindful. If you needed to send an email, I said, hey, can buy you a cup of coffee, sometime in the next couple of weeks, see what they say. And then, they can read between the lines. They know you want something, right? And so that's what I would do. But I would also try to make that connection in person, but if you can, and it's by email, I would just put the bare minimum in an email, because you really don't know who's going to see that in writing. So I think we have time for a final question, and this is from Rowan. How do you think, Bill, I'm going to throw this one to you. How do you think reporters in autocratic countries can encourage government officials to leak? By publishing encrypted signal contacts, appeal to their conscience. Conscience? Did he say conscience? Okay.
I think, Cheryl, that the same techniques and the same approaches that apply to trying to develop a source in the Pentagon, the CIA, or even a police department apply to autocratic countries. You need to see someone in person. You need to figure out whether their interests and your interests can converge in a bona fide story. And you need to figure out a way to make 100% sure that your contact with that person is 100.00% confidential. I've never worked in a place like Russia, but I'm sure that, if I were going there, I would talk to all the old Russian hands and say, how can I make sure that no one ever knows we talked?
Yeah. Well, on that note, I'm going to turn it back over to Eric. I want to say thank you guys. And also, I think Eric will be distributing, I did a source development tip sheet. So I think you guys will get that at some point. Eric?
Yeah, that's right, Cheryl. Thank you both so much. We've had a couple of people in the chat say, oh my God, can you take 1 minute just to have Bill and Cheryl give brief comment on the Supreme Court leak? And because we have multiple people asking you for that.
I saw that question at the end.
Either of you want to take a swing at that?
Yeah, I was talking slowly so the time would run out. I saw that. I'm like, look, I like my job at NPR, okay? So I'm going to kick that over to Bill. And the question was, I don't remember verbatim, but basically, do you think this source, the person who leaked the memo, the report to Politico, could go to jail? Do I have that right? I did it from memory.
Good question. And time's up. No, I think that first of all, I don't think the person can go to jail. I think the person's job could be in jeopardy, but based on what happened back in 1973, when a draft of the original Roe v. Wade decision was leaked, I don't think that the person would be fired, depending on the situation. But it's clear to me that over the years, many Supreme Court clerks and justices have talked on a not for attribution basis to journalists. I read the book by Bob Woodward and Scott Armstrong called The Brethren, and it's crystal clear that dozens of clerks and former clerks talked to the authors because there were details of in-chambers discussions. I wouldn't be surprised if there were also justices who spoke to the press at the time, but I don't know that for a fact. In many cases, some of the people who get appointed to the Supreme Court are former federal appeals court judges who definitely talk to the press. So my opinion is they won't go to jail, but they could be in jeopardy job-wise.
Unless it's, what if it's a Supreme Court justice that leaked it?
Good question, Cheryl. I'll leave that one to you.
Bill and Cheryl.
Yeah. So I find I'm sort of curious that, certain factions where people with this discussion about, this leaked document, that the concern seemed to be more with who leaked it than what was in the report. I sort of thought that was interesting and that's all I'm going to say on it because I'm.
One final footnote, and then I'll cease and desist. We should have made this 2 hours, Cheryl. But I would urge all of you who are listening in, if possible, take a look at today's New York Times website or the front page. And there's a story on the bottom of the front page about a lawyer who's been helping Hunter Biden with his legal troubles. I would urge you to dissect the story, because if you dissect it, you'll see that there's not one named source. They're all allies of the president or supporters or this or that. But the only source is someone who was a law school professor from Cornell who taught this man in law school. But it's fascinating to see. And then if you'll notice, it never says that he refused to comment. So whoever wrote the story, in my opinion, probably was talking to him and his friends, but didn't want to say that he wouldn't comment because that would be untrue. But take a look. It's very, very skillfully done.
Well, and I also think there's an investigation for a reason. They're trying to figure out who leaked it. Now, what they will, if they ever figure it out, what they will do, that who knows?
Yeah.
Right. Who knows what they would do? I'm certainly not a legal expert, nor do I play one on television. So
Cheryl W. Thompson, and Bill Marimo. This has been, as many people have noted in the chat, a packed hour with really, really helpful information and experiences and stories and anecdotes and insights. Thank you both for sharing your time and your experience so generously with all of us. We will, as Cheryl said, be sending out to everybody who registered. You will get probably tomorrow the full recording of this session, as well as some short tips from Cheryl. If you have suggestions for other topics that you would like to see us do webinars like this on, you can DM us on Twitter. You can email us at grants@fij.org and share those thoughts with us. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Have a great day.